Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for the first session of our workshop series about archival description. My name is Caitlin, and I am the Special Collections Consultant at the Northern New York Library Network. For those of you who have joined me for special collections programs in the past, this is going to be a little bit different format. As I alluded to, the word workshop. For those of you who are registered for the class, these videos are going to give you background, and for those not registered for the class, these videos are going to give you background and kind of the theory of archival description, how it works, a lot of knowledge about tools we can use. And then for those of you who are registered for the live workshop part of this class, we'll be practicing the skills we learn here together during those live sessions. So thank you for joining me. Today we are going to start by talking about what archival description is in general, just kind of getting our feet wet, starting to understand what we're going to be talking about over the next, this is going to be a 6-part workshop series, so over the next 6 videos, what we're going to be talking about, and we'll get introduced to a tool that we use in the archival field to help guide our work on description. It's referred to, that short-term name is DACS, and that stands for Describing Archives, a Content Standard. So let's get started. So let's start with the very basics. What is description? Chances are you use this every single day to just try to get someone else to understand what you're talking about, especially when you don't know what something is called. So my homegrown definition is that a description are characteristics of an item or a group of items, or it could even be of anything your senses can kind of perceive. So maybe you heard a song, you could hum it back to someone, but you don't know what the name of it is. Or you saw a car and you don't know what the official make and model of it is, but you can describe its shape, its color, things like that. So it provides context so we're able to share information with other people. That's kind of the root at what this is and why it's important. So what kind of characteristics do we describe? It could be shape, size, material, a texture, maybe a sound, what it's used for. All these kind of description really gives us clues as to what we're talking about so we can have that shared experience. So I just mentioned a bunch of characteristics, and sometimes you'll notice things that make things the same. Another important part of description to get something to stand out and get someone to understand what you're talking about is sometimes you actually want to point out what makes something different. So in the example of these 2 kickballs that just popped up on the screen, kind of in the bottom middle, a lot of things about them are the same. They're the same shape, they're the same size, they're made of the same material. So a way that we're going to be able to get people to understand what we're talking about, if we're trying to describe this to them, is actually by what makes them different. So in this case, their color. One's red, one's blue. So that's something to keep in mind as we move into archival description. Because much like description in any other part of our life, archival description is doing the same type of work. We're trying to convey to someone what characteristics or something about what's in a collection, what might be there, and what they might be interested in it. So we're documenting those characteristics about archival materials. What maybe makes them the same, what makes them different, really describing them to let someone else figure out what they are. Archival description also has a few additional components to think about. So in addition to describing the materials themselves, much like we were describing those kickballs, we also want to describe or document information about how the materials came to be together. So kind of the history of the materials and their use, how they came together, how they came to be at your institution, who created them. So there's a lot of things surrounding the materials themselves, their history, how they came to be, that also is important to describe. And something to keep in mind, and I'll remind you throughout this series, is that description is not a one and done task. It's an ongoing process, which to me, hopefully, like, you can, phew, sigh of relief. Yeah, you can breathe a little bit. Knowing that you're not just going to do it once. You can come back to it. You should come back to it, revise it, change it, edit it. This is important for a few reasons. To do this is, one, you may just not have the time and resources to get into as much detail as you would like originally. Also, society changes over time, and our understanding of how we understand the world around us changes over time. So, getting ahead of myself a little bit, but we're usually writing description for people. We are writing description for people because we want them. That's who we're communicating this information with. And over time, people understand things in different ways. So, for example, at one point in time, there's some commonly known words, such as an occupation called husbandry, that everyone would have known what that is. But in current society, that's not as commonly used anymore. It was kind of a term like someone who cared for the land, cared for animals, kind of like a farmer. So in our description, even though that's a very appropriate term to use, we may actually tweak the word we use to be something that's more in like the common vocabulary and the common knowledge, because again, the goal of description is that we're communicating with someone else so they can figure out what's in this collection in this case. So we're going to want to revisit our description, see if it makes sense, see if it's, culturally appropriate, try not to have it be offensive language, or at least give people warnings if it is. So an ongoing process for sure. So what kinds of things can we describe when we're talking about archival collections? So we can describe a whole collection, so kind of like that palette of multiple boxes of things that's in the picture. We can describe parts or pieces of collections, kind of stepping into more detail. So maybe we have the whole collection, but then we also have kind of subgroups of information of maybe there's certain 2 topics within the collection we want to point out. We can also describe individual items, and we'll get more into this later. And when we think about description, we can also talk about describing what we call unprocessed collections. So those are collections kind of like that messy box on the bottom left picture. And by that, I mean that it hasn't been arranged or organized yet, which is something archivists and special collection staff usually do to help take care of the materials better and also to help researchers use them more efficiently. So then the other kind of category is processed collections, which is like the pretty box you see on the right. It's all in archival folders and sleeves, and probably put into those organized into those categories that'll be helpful to a researcher. But chances are that we're going to potentially do a little bit of both, because you probably will want some kind of a basic description when you get a new donation in, even if you haven't had time to organize it or go through it yet. And then you'll also want to write description for those collections that you have all pretty and organized, because you're going to want researchers to be able to use it. So this, kind of transitions right into, why does our archival description matter? Who are we writing this for? And again, it is for people. Because we want to connect with people and connect people to the collections so that they know it's there, know it exists, and knows what's in it. So this helps kind of different kinds of people, and the description you write can kind of be aimed at different audiences or different stakeholders of who you want that description to be for. So first of all, at the very minimum, you're probably at least writing some kind of basic description so that your staff, volunteers, know what you have in your collection, so that they know it's there and it exists and that they can take care of it. You probably also want description so that you can help researchers, or that researchers know what you have. So kind of like a discovery process. And what that description can be used for will be able to be applied to lots of different things, which we're going to get into. But again, it's kind of having a way to connect your collections with people so they know what you have, so they can figure out if they want to be able to use it or not. Okay, so archival description sounds great. We want to use it. So how do we know what to write down? How do we know what our description should include? And there's kind of two things we're going to think about for the purposes of this introductory course. One is that the materials themselves are going to contain a lot of the information that we're looking for. They're going to tell us about themselves, when they were made, maybe by who. They're going to give us clues. They're going to give us a lot of clues about what they're about. The second thing that's going to help us know what we should write down and what we should describe is a standard in the field for our case. So we're going to get guidance from the profession itself, so from the archival field, of what is best practice description. So that brings me to this thing called DACS that I alluded to at the beginning of this video. And DACS stands for Describing Archives Content Standard. So as it sounds like, this is a standard or guidelines that were written by professionals in the archives field. And it was adopted by a big group that kind of governs archiving and best practices called the Society of American Archivists. In 2005, they officially recognized it as like, yes, this is a good thing to use. This is a good thing to be doing. And there's a subcommittee that kind of reviews and updates and revises it still currently. So what is this thing? So it's a guideline. It's a standard. So they're defining it as rules to ensure the creation of consistent, appropriate, and self-explanatory descriptions of archival materials. They call it rules, which to me sounds a little bit more rigid, but I really like to think of it as it's a guideline to know what to write down. So we're going to get more. We're going to spend the rest of our time kind of figuring out what this is and looking into this. But before we peer under the cover and see what's there, why do we want to use this? Why is this helpful to have this standard? And one of the biggest things is it lets us do consistent data entry. So we know we can capture the same types of information in the same way. And why is that important? It helps us as people who are managing the collections. It just kind of gives us a place to not have to reinvent the wheel all the time, because we already have these predefined categories of information we know we want to capture. So you have to think about it every single time. You just know, here's the information I want to grab. It also, because if we enter the data in a consistent way, it also is going to help us be able to maintain it in the future. You might be able to bulk edit different items instead of going one at a time. So it might help you if you ever, we mentioned earlier that you might want to revise your description in the future. You might catch an error. You might need to update something. So if you can enter data in consistent ways, you'll be able to change it, revise it in kind of a consistent way and make it easier, make your life easier in the future. It also is going to help researchers and people using it, because they will know what to expect. They'll know what fields they should be able to find. It's going to help them find information quickly and concisely, which is what we want. We want to make it as easy as possible to connect people with our data, our information. So the second kind of benefit of using DACS to guide your description work is that it is scalable for use and reuse. So what does that mean? Because DACS is broke up into kind of categories of description information we want to capture, it makes it so that you can build on it in the future, which we said was an important part of description, being able to reuse it. But also because they're broken into kind of discrete categories, they almost serve as building blocks, which you'll see in a second, so that you can kind of rearrange them and plug them in depending on how you're writing your description, if you want to put it in a catalog, if you're putting it in a spreadsheet. So you can kind of take these discrete little components and move them around, rebuild them, rearrange them in order to fit what you need. So it really lets you adapt it to whatever you need it to fit into, which kind of moves into the next point, is that it's output neutral. It has many, many applications because it does have that kind of flexible, we're just capturing categories of information. You can build and rebuild it as you need it. Okay, so we're gonna start, we're gonna open the cover and see what we actually look at when we look at DACS. So when you get to this main landing page, you'll see there's also in the top right corner, there's a PDF version if you'd rather download it, print it, look at it, whatever you want to do with it. I do like this web version because it has really nice navigation and links to the different parts we want to look at. So if we scroll down a little bit, you'll see that it starts, at least in the size my screen is, with the table of contents. And these kind of beginning, the sections that are all in caps are kind of your sections, if you want to think of them that way, kind of the bigger categories. So such as there's in background information in the preface, so it kind of tells you like why the guidelines were written, what their purpose is, statement of principles if you want to kind of get more into the weeds of why does archival description matter, why do we do it. The statement of principles and the overview of archival description are really interesting to look at. And then the big thing I want to point out is that this is divided into two parts, is how this has been broken up. So we have part 1, you can see right here, and then it has a bunch of kind of subparts and subchapters. And the part 1 is where we're going to focus most of our time, and they define it as that it contains the rules to ensure the creation of consistent, appropriate, and self-explanatory descriptions of archival material. So that sounds kind of familiar. We already kind of talked about that. So that's what we really want to focus on. We want to know what we need to write down and what we should put in each field when we're describing our archival materials. Just for the sake of completeness, I'm going to scroll down a little bit more. And you'll see there's a whole bunch of chapters, and it's kind of set up like a book. I just also want to point out part 2 so you know it exists. We're not going to focus on it very much for the purposes of this course since it is kind of an introduction to description in general. But this section provides rules on the creation of what's called authority records, based on elements from a bigger standard that's kind of like an international standard. So this is really kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of, if you've heard of controlled vocabulary or authority records, it's like very standardized, very specifically formatted ways to write things like names, dates, trying to see what else, places. So it's just kind of more specific directions depending on how formatted and how specific you want your description to be, how aligned with, how cataloging is done and things like that. But again, we're not going to worry about that for our purposes. Okay. So you'll see, if we go and just kind of look at part 1, there's an introduction that you can see if you want to know. And this is where it kind of, what I read you about what part 1 is about, this introduces that to us. So if you want to read more, please feel free. I'm not going to do that today. So again, our focus is going to be in that first section, and in those first 8 chapters as they define it. So what's in those chapters exactly? And let's go back and just skim really quickly just to get it in our heads before I start talking more. So if we just read the titles real quick, we see chapter 1 says something about levels of description, whatever that means. We see chapter 2 says identity elements. Chapter 3 says content and structure elements. 4 conditions of access and use elements. So we keep seeing every chapter, except for the first one, it's kind of an outlier, has something about these things called elements. So what are elements? So elements are those categories or the building blocks that I briefly mentioned of description. These are the little pieces that we are going to capture information about our collection, and they're going to tell us, they're going to tell us what those categories should be. In total, there are 25 that are defined in DACS. We are not going to use all 25, and you'll see why in a moment, but they are there and have been kind of defined for us. So what are these elements about? Like, what kinds of information are we capturing? What categories exist? So they're usually about the institution that holds the collection, or about the collection itself, or the materials kind of within it. So if we go back here and we look quickly, we already kind of skimmed some of these titles. But under this identity elements in chapter 2, we see something called name and location of repository. We also see something that's talking about dates, names of creators. So these are the categories of information that we are going to be capturing. So if we back up just briefly to when we talked about what can we describe when we do archival description. I mentioned that we can do whole collections, we can do parts or like subcomponents of collections, and we can also do individual items. Well, when we're talking about archival description and we're talking about how DACS thinks about archival description, there's something called levels of description, and that's at chapter 1 that we kind of skimmed by. And what that is talking about is the different groupings or the level of detail that's being described about the archival materials. So if we look at this diagram, it'll kind of help us understand it. So at the very top, so the biggest bucket of information we can have is a whole collection. We're talking about all of the stuff that exists. Then within that, you can have something called a series. So think of these like topical subgroups. So almost like in that menu, in the DACS menu, it's kind of like our chapters. You've kind of broken up into smaller chunks that have something to do with each other. And then within that, you can kind of get even more granular. It's kind of almost like looking at a family tree. You can get even more granular and talk about files within the topic or individual items. So when DACS is talking about the levels of description, is talking about these different groupings or how many groups we're describing at a time. Are we just describing one individual thing? Or are we describing a bunch of chunks of information? And this becomes really important because DACS tells us what kind of information we want to capture depending on how many groupings or how many levels of detail that we're talking about. So the way that DACS defines this is they have something called single level. So that's when we're just talking about one group or one chunk of material, whether that's a whole collection or an individual item. And then they have another thing that they call multi-level description, which means you're describing multiple levels of details or multiple chunks of information at a time. And for the purposes of this course, we're going to keep it simple, and we're just going to talk about describing one chunk or one item of information at a time. So why do we care about these levels? And the reason is that DACS, again, tells us what kind of information we should capture, and they assign like levels of requirements to what kind of information we should capture based on what kind of description, so that single level or multi-level that we're doing. They give us some rules about that. So the types of levels of requirements that exist include required. So if you capture nothing else about the material, please at least try to write down something here. They also have 2 other categories, which I'm sure they define the very nitty-gritty difference between them, but there's something called optimum. So like if you have time, this is great information to capture. And then there's also one called added value, which is a little bit kind of farther down the tier, not as urgent to capture, but if it applies to your materials, or again, you have more time to write more description, these might be nice to include. So how do we know what we need to capture? So I mentioned we're doing single level description. So I'm going to go back here. But before we look at this any further, let's recap what we know so far, just because it's been a lot of information kind of quickly. So we know that DACS, so this thing we're looking at right now, is a standard or a guideline to help us know how to write archival description. We also know that these guidelines were written down into this manual, this standard, and it's made of 2 parts. And we're looking at the first part that's going to tell us what categories or elements of materials to capture and how to do that. And we also know that archival materials can be arranged or organized into different groupings, different levels of detail. And that could impact how much detail that we want to write in our descriptions. So that's this level of descriptions chapter we're looking at right now. And we're going to focus on something called single level. So it's describing one group, one chunk of detail of information. So if we scroll down in this chapter 1, levels of description, then we can see that there is single level required section. So as I mentioned, there was 25 defined elements or categories of information, and we're not going to use them all. So these are the ones, these required elements are what we're going to focus on of what we, if we do nothing else, we want to include these 10 when we write our description. And as you see, if I keep scrolling, there's also something called single level. There's that optimum category I mentioned. So like if you have time, this is also nice, which we will look at in this course. And then there's added value, which we won't look at, but you may notice as we scroll through. And then just as a quick aside, so you know it exists, if you have collections that are more complicated and you feel like getting into it, there's a section about the requirements for multi-level descriptions. And there's a whole bunch of information. And you can see the multi-level required elements, and it goes into all kinds of detail. But again, we're going to focus on this single level. We're going to focus on these 10 required elements to describe one chunk of information, as well as a couple optimum ones that are just because they have a lot of value to researchers if they are present. So we're going to look at them. So how this is going to work for the purposes of this course is today we're really just focusing on DACS and how to navigate it, what it contains. And then the next several sessions are going to break these elements down individually. So we're going to take time to break these now 12 elements apart and walk through them one by one with examples and things like that. So that's what's coming up. We're not doing all of this today. So we are now so we've mentioned elements, we know their categories of information. So now we're going to see how do we actually navigate and kind of like what's the anatomy of an element entry when we're looking at it in DACS. So let's go back to DACS, and I'm going to scroll to the top. And you can see I have this, the table of contents is now appearing on the side because I'm kind of in the chapters. So just so you can see it better, I'm going to go back to the home page. So just by clicking on the top name of it. Okay, so let's figure out, so what exactly does an element contain? What does that category, those categories of information tell us? And you can see they broke the elements kind of into chunks by chapter. They put kind of similar things together. They don't really define that. I saw how they've decided to break it up. But for our purposes, so to navigate to a specific element, if we're I want to know how to write the name and the location of the repository. So we're going to go to chapter 2, and then we're going to click on element 2 just as an example. So we're going to use these hyperlinks to navigate to what I'm going to call the element entry, so the record about the element. And then you'll see once we get in here, there's a whole bunch of information. So let's just quickly go back to the slides because I've just kind of broke it down so we can look at it at one piece at a time. So the first thing you're going to see when you get to that element entry, and again, every one is kind of similar, has similar sections. The first thing you're going to see in that top line is you see an element number, and the way this is defined is you have the chapter number, so it's chapter 2, and then the element number, so that's the period, the second 2. Then you're going to get the name of the element, which also kind of describes what it's about, or the title, I guess, if you want, of the element. So this one says name and location of repository. And then you're going to get that description status, is what I'm calling it, but the requirement level that it has. So this one is listed as required. So that means if we do nothing else, we should try to include this information. Up next, there's a section that's called purpose and scope, and every element has this. And what that tells you is what the element is for. This kind of gives you the definition of what this element is doing. So in the purposes of this, it says the element identifies the name and the location of the repository that holds the materials being described. Depending on the element, some are lengthier in their descriptions and some are short and sweet like this one. So this is just telling us what the element is for. Next up, there's usually a section called sources of information. So what this is telling us is where can we find this information. So usually there's kind of two options. As I mentioned earlier, usually the information is coming from the materials themselves. Other times it's about the institution, so it might come from institutional policies or procedures or something like that. And finally, there's a general rules section. Sometimes some other bonus sections in between, but these are kind of the standard ones. So this tells us how to actually populate the element. So in this case, if we look at this example, it says explicitly state the name of the repository, including any parent bodies. But the really nice thing is what follows. So let me go back so I can make this a little bigger for you. Is that you can see here, there's actually examples of like, okay, it gave us the directions, but what do they mean by that? And you can see some actual examples. So here's like a second option. It says provide the location of the repository in this example. You may also want to include other contact information. So like what do they mean by that? Well, here we can see they put the name, they have an address, and we also have a phone number. So again, this is a guideline. So remember, take the pieces that you want to use what makes sense for what you want to get into, how much description you want to write. But there's a lot of really useful information embedded in here that you can look at and use to help yourself. So let's look at an example of something called a finding aid. So this is kind of a public tool for people to be able to know what's in a collection, kind of think of it like a roadmap to a collection. So we're going to look at this as an example of description that already exists and is already written so that we can see some of the things that we just talked about that's in DACS and how it can be applied in real life to an example. So this collection is about work done by Diana Denny. She was a caricature and illustrative artist, and we'll see this example again. So we'll get more into what she did. But when we're looking at this, we're just going to kind of see what does description look like when it's out in the real world, and what kind of information are they capturing. We may recognize even some elements, some that we just skimmed today from our guideline or from DACS. And so we're just today's kind of about exploring and just kind of seeing what description's all about. So we can see, we know that this is at the Library of Congress. That's interesting. We can see that this finding aid was created by their staff in 2021, so we know when this was made, how recent, how relevant it might be, how up to date. So what other types of information can we learn from this? So you can see that a lot of this information is kind of in very like short, little, discrete things, so it's very easy to read, very fast to kind of get a sense. So remember, we're writing this for people to get information from, so we want to make it easy. We don't want them to have to sift through tons of information to figure out if they're interested in it or not. So we can see that this tells us this is a summary about the collection. We have a title about what it's called. We have dates that it includes. We know who made it. We have a creator, extent. So, and again, these are all elements we'll be reviewing over the next few weeks, so we know how to write them and populate them ourselves. But we know how much stuff there is, 397 drawings, newspaper clippings. We know what language it's in. Then we see we have some other kinds of notes, such as provenance, so it came in as a gift from two different people, groups of people. I'm just going to scroll down. So so far we're seeing that a collection is being described. So that would be kind of single level because it's a one big chunk of information. We can see how we can get a hold of someone if we want to look at the material. They tell us that there's some information, some material already digitized, and it's online. Whoop. Sorry about that. I clicked a link I didn't mean to. We can, if we want to do research with this, we can see how to cite it. There's information about the creator. And here's something a little different that we are not going to write a lot ourselves, but I want you to be aware of. So back to the levels of description. So this arrangement tells us that that one big collection is organized into groups called lots. So in this case, this is a multi-level description because they're going to give us information about subgroupings. So we have the information about the collection, and then we also have more description information, which we should find as we keep scrolling, about these subgroups. Search terms. So here's descriptions of those subgroups, or series as they're called in archives land. So now we can see we're getting more descriptions. So we kind of have a title of this series. It has its own kind of unique number, and then it has its own kind of little description about what it is. So in this case, since we have the big collection group and then a subgroups of series, or kind of discrete chunks, so by this case looks like formats. We have caricatures in one group. They've organized newspaper clippings and things like that together in another group, and then they specifically put drawings of a Nuremberg trial in a third group. So we have multiple levels of detail or description. And then finally, in this case, they give us a container list, so we can see every box and folder and what's in it, where it lives if we wanted to go and look at it, pull it. Okay, so that is just us exploring what kind of description can look like. So let's look at another example. So that was something that kind of described a whole collection or chunks of a collection. But we can also have, as I mentioned, this description can be moved around. They're kind of like building blocks. They can be used for multiple things. So they can also be used in things like catalog entries. So in this case, there is, so what are we looking at? So it's a catalog entry, but for what? And we can see here it's for one drawing. So now instead of looking at a whole collection, we're looking at an individual item. But we can still see a lot of the same elements that were used in that finding aid example. So we still have a title, we still have a creator, and we still have dates that it was made. So again, we're starting to see that we capture the same types of information about all of our materials because that's helpful to a researcher. They know what to expect. It's helpful to us to know what we have, and so we can take care of it. We have subjects again, kind of those search points. We know what formats it's made of, what collection it's in. I'm just going to let you look at the image better because I thought it was pretty great. So this is titled Charwomen at the Library of Congress no longer scrub on their hands and knees. Now they have lightweight mops. So anyway, the point of all of this is just to give you a sense. So here's another work. So this was all work by Diana Denny. So just to get a sense that we're seeing these repetitive fields. So those elements, they must have been using DACS at least in part, and that if we're kind of looking at it from a researcher perspective right now, it's helping us to know a lot about the collection very quickly, and that's kind of the point of description, is we're wanting to convey information to other people. Okay, so with that, I again just wanted to start with the basics today. So for those of you who are registered in the class, we're going to practice how to read and use DACS, especially those part 1 sections with the rules and the elements. And we're going to analyze some example discovery tools just to see what kind of information capturing, again, kind of just exploring description. What does it look like? What does it look like in different formats? And for those of you who are not registered for this section of the live courses, I will see you in the next video. So thank you. Have a good day.